So usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's like this certain expectation of precision, you know?
Oh, absolutely.
Like
Yeah.
if you fall and break your arm, the X-ray just shows this jagged white line, and the doctor points at the film and says, well, there it is.
Right. It's very visible, categorized.
Exactly. It's a clean binary system. Like it's either broken or it's not.
But then you step into the world of lived psychology.
Yeah.
Specifically, the landscape of severe invisible psychological trauma. And suddenly, that X-ray machine is just completely useless.
We basically find ourselves looking at a diagnostic landscape that is incredibly murky, which is, I mean, it's deeply unsettling for a lot of people.
Oh, for sure. Because we prefer trauma to leave a visible bruise, right?
Right.
But when you're dealing with systemic gaslighting or, scapegoating, the damage is atmospheric. It's completely invisible to the naked eye.
And that is exactly what we are unpacking today. So welcome to the deep dive. For this discussion, we're looking at a stack of clinical notes alongside this central foundational essay titled Alice in the Keyhole.
It's a fascinating text.
It really is. And our mission for today's deep dive is to map out this very specific, radical journey that the author proposes. Like, we're going to trace how a person actually moves from experiencing that invisible devastation, being chronically gaslit, to achieving absolute radical self-sovereignty.
Well, the author makes a highly unconventional choice in how they map this out.
Yeah, they really do.
They take the modern lived experience of psychological trauma and they deconstruct it using ancient Hindu mythology.
Specifically the frameworks of the divine forces, Vishnu and Parvati.
Right.
But I do want to state right up front for you listening, our goal today is not to endorse this framework as, like, absolute objective truth or to take any political or religious side.
No, not at all.
Our job is simply to impartially guide you through the journey this text outlines. Because, whether you're familiar with the mythology or not, if you've ever felt like your reality was being constantly rewritten by someone else.
Like a difficult boss, maybe.
Yeah, talk to a family member, a partner, whoever. If you felt that, the mechanisms described here are going to sound very, very familiar to you.
Definitely. And to ground this entire journey, the text introduces a foundational concept called the home temperature.
The home temperature?
Yeah. Metaphorically, this represents a person's ontological baseline.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second, because ontological baseline is a pretty heavy academic phrase.
It is, yeah.
Functionally, what does that actually look like for you or me on, say, a random Tuesday afternoon?
Well, think of it as your absolute state of being before anyone else's opinions enter the room.
Ooh, I like that.
Right. It's your energetic set point, your core boundaries, your emotional climate, your undeniable truth. Basically, it's the environment where your psyche naturally thrives.
Okay, so to put an analogy to this, imagine someone walks right through the front door of your house during a howling sub-zero blizzard.
Okay, painting a picture here.
Right. They step inside. They're completely covered in snow, freezing cold, and they immediately start complaining that the heat in your living room is way too high.
Of course.
They demand you turn it down, but they just completely refuse to acknowledge the fact that they literally just dragged a winter storm inside with them.
Yes. And the author points out that this is the exact dynamic Alice faces in the text.
Yeah.
Society constantly takes her temperature entirely out of context. I mean, they experience the heat of her boundaries or maybe the chill of her logic, and they immediately judge it.
Without looking at the blizzard.
Exactly. They never acknowledge the environmental chaos that actually provoked her defensive temperature in the first place.
Right. And the text gives two very specific examples of this, which I found super interesting. If she uses what the author calls protective fire, which is basically just righteous anger to defend your boundaries, society immediately labels her as unstable.
Unstable, right.
But then if she flips her approach, and uses a preserving, detached logic to hold those exact same boundaries, suddenly she's labeled unfeeling or cold.
It's a trap. They're viewing her massive, complex internal ecosystem through this tiny, flawed aperture.
A keyhole.
A keyhole, exactly. And the keyhole perspective is really the core of the injustice she experiences here. They don't see the storms she's sheltering from. They only judge the heat of her hearth.
Right.
And the underlying psychological mechanism here is crucial to understand. The people complaining about her temperature are structurally incapable of regulating their own internal climates.
Meaning they are deeply dysregulated themselves.
Profoundly dysregulated. And because they literally cannot manage their own internal chaos, their only coping mechanism is to demand that she adjust her thermostat to make them comfortable.
Oh, wow.
That is the root engine of gaslighting. It's deeply dysregulated individuals looking at someone whose reality is actually perfectly calibrated and just telling them that their reality is wrong.
That sounds absolutely maddening.
It is.
Like, to have someone tell you your perfectly functional heating system is broken just because they're personally shivering, all while they were standing next to the front door they left wide open.
It's wild, yeah.
So, the question becomes, how does a person's mind survive that? Like, if your fundamental reality is being constantly denied by the outside world, how do you keep from collapsing inward?
Well, that brings us to the internal architecture of her psyche.
Yeah.
And the text posits a really compelling argument here. It says her psyche is not actually split or broken by this trauma.
Yeah.
Instead, it operates as a profound dichotomy that is seeking synthesis. And this is where that mythological framework steps in.
Right, the Hindu deities.
Yeah. The author suggests she houses two supreme forces. You have the masculine force of preservation and the feminine force of creation.
Okay, let's explore the masculine aspect first, Vishnu. How does the text define this force within her?
So in cosmic architecture, Vishnu is the foundational reality. He's the sustainer, right? The unyielding axis upon which existence turns. As it relates to a person's internal boundaries, the defining characteristic of Vishnu is that he cannot submit.
I want to dig into the mechanics of that for a second. Why is submission impossible for this part of her psyche?
Well, because a foundation cannot bow to the house it supports.
Oh, that makes sense.
Right. If you compromise the foundation, the entire structure comes down. So her inner masculine aspect, this protective core, it operates on the absolute knowledge that her boundaries are divine law, or dharma.
Dharma, right.
So when a toxic gaslighting society demands that she soften her boundaries or, comply with their illusions, her enemy Vishnu just flat out refuses.
Because to submit to their dysregulation would basically be a violation of her own structural integrity.
Exactly.
Okay, I get that. It's the bedrock.
Yeah.
But then we have the feminine side, represented by Parvati.
Yes, the divine mother.
Right. The text describes her as the embodiment of Shakti. She's dynamic, lived, breathing energy. And her entire drive is this desire for union and love and authentic connection.
She's seeking what the author calls universal root source heart space integration.
Which basically means Parvati wants to exist with an open, integrated heart, offering grace and warmth to the world around her. She wants to connect deeply.
Yes, very authentically.
Here is where it gets really interesting, though, because I have to push back a little. Looking at this from a purely practical standpoint, it seems totally contradictory.
How so?
Well, how can you, as a person walking around in the real world, house an unyielding, rigid foundation that refuses to compromise Vishnu while simultaneously housing a dynamic energy that is desperately seeking open, vulnerable connection Parvati?
Right.
Like, doesn't it create a massive internal war within the psyche?
This raises an important question, and honestly, it's a very natural reaction. It seems like a total paradox.
Yeah.
But the insight the author provides is that these aren't warring factions at all. They are actually a highly evolved psychological immune system.
An immune system. Wait, how does that work?
Think about human biology for a second. You have a rigid skeletal structure that provides unyielding support, right?
Right.
It doesn't bend, it doesn't compromise. But you also have a dynamic cardiovascular system that pumps life and warmth and vulnerability throughout the whole body.
Oh, I see.
One requires the other to survive. Vishnu protects the house. He provides the unyielding walls so that Parvati, the warmth, the life, the vulnerable energy gets to live freely and safely inside.
Wow.
Vishnu's rigidity is precisely what makes Parvati's vulnerability possible.
So internally, they're working in perfect symbiotic harmony.
Yeah.
The boundaries protect the heart.
Exactly.
But if her internal system is so well calibrated, where is all the friction coming from? Like, why is she experiencing so much trauma?
Well, the friction occurs at the broadcast level.
The broadcast level.
Yeah, Parvati's open-hearted offer of authentic connection is being broadcast outward into an environment that is structurally incapable of receiving it.
Ah. So to understand the trauma, we really have to look at the antagonists in this scenario.
Yes. The tragedy in Alice in the Keyhole is that her divine integration is cast into a world built on Maya, or illusion.
And the author paints a very stark picture of the people operating within this illusion. It's like this fascinating progression of cause and effect.
It really is.
It starts with a fundamental gap in perception, what the text calls naivety. These antagonists genuinely believe their narrow worldview is the objective truth.
Right, they lack the depth to perceive her full integration. They can't see the house, so they assume the keyhole is all that exists.
And that limited capacity is the catalyst for everything that follows. Because when she acts authentically, it creates friction with their narrow worldview.
Yes.
Her truth exposes the inadequacy of their illusions. And that exposure triggers immense fear, which leads directly to their next behavior, which is deceit.
Exactly. They have to twist her actions entirely out of context to frame her as the problem.
Just to avoid looking at their own inadequacies.
Precisely.
But that toxic fear and cognitive dissonance has to go somewhere, right? They can't just hold on to it internally.
Which is the exact mechanism that causes scapegoating.
Ah.
They take their own flaws, their unacknowledged failures, and their negative energy, and they project it completely onto her.
Wow.
They force her to carry the psychic weight they refuse to process themselves. It's basically a defense mechanism designed to keep their own hands clean.
You know, if you're listening to this and you've ever been in a family dynamic or maybe a workplace where you somehow became the problem just by pointing out a dysfunction,
Yes,
that is the scapegoating mechanism happening in real time.
it is.
And it culminates in the final stage, which is false superiority.
Yeah.
To regain a sense of control over the narrative, they demand her submission. They demand she play by their ego-driven rules despite being spiritually hollow themselves.
It's a profound failure to submit to any higher truth.
But looking at this cycle, well, actually, wait. If these antagonists are so spiritually hollow and they're so deeply invested in their own illusions, why do they even bother engaging with her at all?
That's a great point.
Right. Like, if her authenticity bothers them so much, why not just walk away? Why engage in such an actively hostile campaign to gaslight her?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to look at what her very existence threatens. For them to truly see her home temperature in its proper context, they would have to acknowledge the blizzard.
They would have to admit they dragged the storm inside in the first place.
Exactly. They would have to confess to their own blindness, their own deceit, and really face their profound emotional immaturity.
Which is terrifying for them.
Terrifying. For someone operating entirely on ego and illusion, doing that isn't just uncomfortable, it is ego annihilation.
Wow.
Admitting her reality is valid would destroy their entire concept of themselves. So they are literally fighting for psychological survival.
And so they lock her outside of their false reality, force her to look through the keyhole of their prejudice, and label her as the crazy one.
Because if she isn't crazy, then they are.
That is a chilling realization.
Yeah.
They are fighting to the death for a lie. Which, I mean, that leaves Alice at a devastating impasse.
It does.
The world around her is structurally locked into these illusions. Waiting for them to suddenly wake up or to finally apologize and validate her truth is just a trap.
It's just draining her vital energy, her Shakti, into a total void.
So how does a person actually resolve this? How does she achieve that radical self-sovereignty we talked about at the beginning?
The resolution requires a massive internal pivot. The author calls it a radical epistemological shift.
Wait, epistemological shit, let's break that down for the listener.
Mm-hmm.
Functionally, what does that actually mean when you were sitting across the table from a gaslighter?
Okay, so epistemology is the study of how we know what we know. It's how we determine truth.
Right.
So an epistemological shift means she completely changes the source she uses to validate her reality. She stops using the external world as a mirror. She realizes she needs to stop trying to fit her vast reality through their tiny keyhole.
Because she realizes she is the entire house.
Yes. She accepts a profound practical conclusion. Nobody in this illusionary world is capable of submitting to her truth. They are just too broken and too invested in their own defense mechanisms.
So the goal completely changes. Ultimate integration is no longer about forcing the world to see her. It's about fully submitting to herself.
Exactly.
And the text calls this the alchemy of self-submission. It lays out a very clear 3-step process to achieve it.
The first step is detachment. Once she realizes they're incapable of understanding, she simply stops explaining her home temperature.
She stops debating.
Right, she stops debating with people who are determined to freeze her out or burn her down. She withdraws her energy from the conflict entirely.
Because arguing with an illusion only validates the illusion.
Exactly.
And by withdrawing that outward energy, she frees up the resources for the second step, which is the inner marriage.
Yes, and this is where the mythological metaphor reaches its peak. Her inner Parvati, that dynamic part of her seeking connection and validation, stops looking for it in the external world.
She turns inward.
She turns inward. She submits entirely to the protection of her own inner Vishnu.
And this is where that immune system we talked about fully activates. Right?
You got it. By turning inward, the feminine submits to her own internal masculine structure. And in response, Vishnu steps up. That unyielding foundation wraps entirely around Parvati, creating a closed, impenetrable circuit of divine energy.
The boundaries completely encase the vulnerable heart.
Yes, and that closed circuit naturally creates the final step, which is anchoring in the root source heart space.
Okay.
By submitting entirely to herself, she becomes a self-sustaining universe. The external gaslighting evaporates because the mechanism has been totally bypassed. She no longer requires their agreement to validate her existence.
So what does this all mean? Think about it like taking a house completely off the municipal power grid.
Oh, I love this analogy.
Like, imagine for years you've been arguing with the city about the terrible power supply, the constant blackouts, the power surges ruining your appliances. You are constantly fighting them to fix the grid.
Right, begging them to change.
But then, one day, you just stop. You install your own solar panels and a massive battery bank in your basement. You close your own circuit.
Yes.
Once you are generating your own internal electricity and running entirely on your own power, you simply do not care if the rest of the city is having a blackout. You are warm, the lights are on, the debate is completely over.
That analogy perfectly captures the shift. When you are off the grid, the city's dysfunction is no longer your emergency.
Seriously.
And that brings Alice to what the text calls the sovereign epiphany. She reaches a state of total clarity, captured in this deeply memorable quote, "If they think I am crazy, it is because my sanity is illegible to their madness."
My sanity is illegible to their madness.
Wow. That just completely reframes the experience of being misunderstood.
It does.
It's no longer a failure to communicate. It's
Yeah.
simply realizing you are speaking a language they physically do not have the capacity to hear.
She finds ultimate peace, not by conquering the hypocrites, not by proving them wrong in some grand debate, but by rendering them entirely irrelevant to her existence. She decides to live fully within the vast, perfect temperature of her own divine home.
Yes.
It's such a profound departure from how we are usually taught to heal from trauma. Like, the instinct is always to fight back, you know?
Oh, always. To gather all the evidence.
Right. To gather the evidence, hold it up to the people who hurt you, and demand they acknowledge your reality.
But this framework argues that ultimate freedom in a gaslighting world comes from walking away from the debate.
It comes from closing your own circuit, stepping out of the blizzard, locking your front door, and just enjoying the warmth of your own perfectly calibrated temperature.
It is the ultimate withdrawal of participation from the illusion.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, there is a lingering thought that arises from this text. Something really fascinating for you to mull over on your own as you navigate your own internal thermostat today.
It's a big question.
The author beautifully describes Parvati retreating into Vishnu's protection, closing the circuit, and creating this self-sustaining universe. It is a triumphant, absolutely necessary moment for the individual's survival. But if we pull back and look at the macro picture, what happens to the rest of the world?
It's critical. When the dynamic, open-hearted individuals finally realize the game is rigged and withdraw their energy, what is actually left behind?
Yeah, what happens when all the truth-seeking Parvatis of the world finally decide to close their circuits and stop trying to integrate with a broken society?
Right.
Does the world outside the keyhole simply freeze over, left entirely to the coldness of its own illusions?
It makes you wonder.
It really makes you wonder who is actually keeping the lights on out there in the blizzard. Something to think about the next time someone complains about the heat. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Stay warm out there.